Hello, listeners. It's Gunter Swoboda here with some exciting news. We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self development, and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number one in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spiegner Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Welcome everybody back to Inspire Change with Gunter. Today we're going to do something a little bit different, and I have my guest to thank for that. Now, I'm assuming that you've listened to the show for a while. Some of you may not have, but in any case, you'll know I like to bring psychology, anthropology, the neurosciences, history and philosophy into the same conversation when we're talking especially about men, masculinity and social change. My guest today has been working at that intersection for a long time. Professor Downey is a cultural anthropologist and neuroanthropologist at Macquarie University. His work explores how culture quite literally shapes our brains and bodies. He's done field work on Afro-Brazilian capoeira, I hope I pronounced that right, mixed martial arts, free diving, and human echolocation. Very interesting field. And he's written extensively about how practice and training rewire perception, movement, and emotion. Greg has also profoundly influenced my thinking, especially in how I view masculinity as something that's embodied and practiced, not just a set of ideas or roles that we take on. Now, here's the twist. When we were talking about doing this episode, it was Greg who said, why don't we flip it? Instead of you interviewing me, let me interview you. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. Greg, welcome back to Inspire Change.
Thanks, Gunter. Yeah, it's good to be back. And I'm glad you agreed to the switch in format, but I hope it's interesting to everybody who's listening and maybe gets you into some places you don't usually go. I've learned a lot from working with Gunter, and he's helping me to really focus my own lens on masculinity, what's happening in popular culture, what's happening for men right now in Australia, the US, elsewhere. And I kind of wanted to start off with a sort of long-term question for you, Gunter. You've been doing this work for 40 years plus. You've been working with men, adolescent boys, and it's shaped your understanding of masculinity. So your approach is not based in theory, it's based more in day-to-day working with people, dealing with all kinds of issues. Can you point to, or was there a time when you started to realize that there needed to be a fundamental shift, or there needed to be a change in the way we think about masculinity, men's issues? Was there some point you could pin back in time when you realized we need to talk about this? It's not good enough what we're doing. And is there anything that sort of pushed you to look for a transformation, to look for a change?
There's actually several. The first one was I started really focusing on men's issues through working with Vietnam veterans. And that was in the early 80s. And part of it was through drug and alcohol, because a lot of the vets had drug and alcohol issues. And the framework was always pathological. You know, they were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. They had substance abuse disorders. And so that was the framework. But as I was working with them, one of the things that I realized was these were men who felt socially completely dislocated. And I started wondering about how, you know, like after World War II, we had people coming back as heroes. And I know full well from growing up in the 70s until Whitlam sort of got us out of the Vietnam War, that these people were not venerated as heroes. They were seen as social pariahs often. And so coming out of it from a philosophical basis, everyone was talking about, you know, physical and psychological injuries. And the thing that stood out for me were that these guys were suffering from a moral injury. So that was the first one. The second one was I found myself part of the sort of first wave of the men's movement. You know, there was people like Iron John,
Robert Bly, yeah.
Robert Bly with Iron John. There was a number of sort of mythopoetic writers. Joseph Campbell, you know, became very much a driver with the hero's journey. And having worked with veterans and combat veterans and then first responders, what stood out for me was that the hero's journey is somewhat misleading in that framework. You know, we're not talking about heroes. In fact, the last thing most of them wanted to be is heroic. I was also then starting to work with teenagers, and everyone was talking about initiation rites. So my wife, my partner, Lauren Joseph, who's part of the second edition of Making Good Men Great, Surfing a New Masculinity, challenged me. And she said, you know, all this stuff about going out into the wilderness and, you know, being naked, playing drums, throwing spears. And she was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I got where she was coming from. She said, is that making men better partners, husbands, and fathers? And I actually had to sit back and go, I don't know. I'm not really sure. What I did know is that there was sort of an enhancement of some narcissistic qualities in that. And so I went, we're missing the point here. And then the wave died. Like all waves, you know, it hit the shore and sort of fizzled out for a bit. And then the next part of this was seeing the emergence through social media of the sort of warrior, you know, the Andrew Tates, the Jordan Peterson, who profess to being involved in you know, shoring men up, teaching them how to be men again, be masculine. You know, the term alpha wolf or alpha male kept being spread around. And, you know, amidst it all, I was working with men who were also, well, two types of men. Men who were emotionally dysregulated and prone to acting aggressively in relationships and occasionally violent, but also men who were actually the victim of violence. And again, the notion of being binary, these are good men, these are bad men, started to feel less appropriate. And that I went, you know, hang on a minute, you know, we need to look at this historically. We need to look at this socially. This is not something, you know, that's inherently necessarily biological even. because I also did some work with gay men, and that gave me a new perspective on that type of masculinity as well. So they're sort of the milestones and since then my thinking's really gone on to an even richer plane.
Let me just go back to something you just said and sort of redirect. You said that you were working with men who were emotionally dysregulated and prone to violence, and some men who were the victims of violence, and that these were sort of dichotomized as good men and bad men. And you say it didn't really look that way to you. What do you mean by that? I mean, condemning like domestic violence would seem to be the most obvious thing. What are you seeing in the contrast between those two groups?
The thing that stood out for me was that we couldn't throw all the men into the same basket. And so when I talk about domestic violence, we talk about the perpetrator, but often the perpetrator is actually a victim in themselves. And so my propensity to avoid, binary arguments or explanations really came to the fore there. And I said, this conversation is much, much more complex. We need to look at issues, and this is where, the intersection of our fields of knowledge, I think, is really important. That the temptation to throw, the psychiatric or psychological umbrella over this, unless we can do that, but we need also a richer rhetoric, a richer epistemology around it. We really need to understand deeper than what we do currently in the sort of political and even medical field, because psychiatry has really gone into the whole biological explanation of whatever it is that we as humans do, good, bad, or indifferent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm gonna come back to this. I think I want to give you another question that's sort of more on the it comes from some stuff of yours that I've read. Then I want to come back to the question of richer understandings. But let's start with a current understanding. And you've said in some of your writing that men need to realize that they've either been sold or they've bought into a kind of toxic ideology that is hurting themselves and hurting others. Can you just sort of walk us through what that toxic ideology is and sort of explain that in the way you see it today? Sort of before we go on to what needs to improve, what's the current state of that toxic ideology? How do you understand that?
So I'm going to throw this as sort of ancient history, modern history perspective, okay? So in some of my writings, I point out that patriarchy, which is, inherently the sort of traditional masculine framework, originated somewhere around 8 to 10,000 years ago, and it was ratified by Hammurabi in the Codex, where women were fundamentally marginalized, ownership and lineage now became male-oriented, male-focused, and we began to see the emergence of a very strict hierarchy that would involve possessions, basically, both material but also social. Social was about power. And so the hierarchy was the thing that, men began to be socialized in, that you are part of a power structure and there is a status attached to each of the layers, and it designates who has and who hasn't. And in a very simplistic terms, women didn't have it. They could now, in many instances, be, sold, even if it's only symbolically, like, dowry. I'm going to give you my daughter, you give me 20 sheep. The way that hierarchy and status were interconnected then was through the accumulation of wealth as well as power. So wealth and power now became hand in hand. And the pinnacle in some ways at that level was that men were socialized to be competitive. So we saw the emergence of, who's the best in the field of sword play, the warrior games. The Assyrians and the Greeks did a really good job of it. So these behaviors were the model for the embodied male, in my view. All right? And you had a lot to do with my formulation around that framework, because you pointed me into Pierre Bourdieu's habitus, right? And this is where it clicked. And went, yes, it's not biological. Men are not biologically geared towards this. We're socialized into it. And I know this from observing little boys and little girls. I've seen enough little boys sit back and play with dolls, right, as much as the next minute is they're playing with trucks and rumbling with each other. And, watching my daughter and my son at the age of, 4 and 2, she was as good at rumbling as he was, and it was like watching two lion cubs at it. So the whole notion of this biological inherent way of being started to really erode. Now, really, truly erode. And so we've got this socialization. With those behaviors emerged the value set. So the value set is about exclusive, about a hierarchy, it's about acquisition, it's about competition. And the final one, that the last piece that slots in, is when we don't get our way, figuratively speaking or literally, we become combative. And so for me, it took the whole notion of Raymond Connell's idea of the hegemonic masculinity into a much more operational field, because out of that, I could then attach it to, okay, so part of this picture is emotional restriction, dominance, control, and coercion. And so now we have a process where we connect this socialization process with the psychological dynamic that emerges from childhood onwards into the relational space. So what do I do with other people in my field? Well, if I'm a male, I'm going to be, needing to forge my space with other men, but I also need to forge my space with women. So how am I going to do that? Right? So the body becomes very much an enactment of those values. So, the masculinized, it's like, watching 300. I've never seen so many six-packs in all my life on the celluloid screen. I'm not sure whether the Greeks were that packed. They were pretty cut, but I'm not sure to that degree.
Let me ask you about that. So that's sort of the sociological, historical, but you started to touch on there. How does it actually wind up in individuals' psychology? Like how does this history wind up manifesting in an individual man's habitus or in his interactions with other people? And that's, I guess, what I want to sort of like let's bore in right on that real quick. In all the work you're doing, both online, podcasting, but also in your practice, how are these misconceptions from hegemonic masculinity and from the ideology, how are they showing up in individuals' lives? What do you see as like the way? Because one of the things I'm struck by is that you laid out an ideal for masculinity that a lot of people are going to fail on. They're not going to acquire all the material goods. They're not going to acquire the physical dominance. So how do you see it in actual men manifesting? How is it stopping them? What are they afraid of? What's holding them back when they come to you and they've got how is this impacting men?
So psychodynamically, one of the things that's really clearly evident from teenagers onward, I see men who essentially suffer from the narcissistic wound. And it's not necessarily the father wound, but it's close to it. There's a number of ways, and I'm still working on actually putting a very concise framework around that.
What do you mean by narcissistic wound?
Well, essentially, in their socialization, through attachment, let's focus on boys. Boys develop a sense of self, right? Now, if they're securely attached, they're going to feel pretty safe and secure in the world, right? And as they get older, their sense of self now enables them to feel safe and secure in themselves. So they don't have, for example, status anxiety. So if someone takes your business card away, right, and tears it up because you've been made redundant, you're not going to go into inherently a fundamental crisis, a narcissistic crisis, because you know who you are. The job was a job. It's going to hurt. There is no question about that. And it's going to take some rethinking, but it isn't going to trigger depression, which is inherently, my nihilistic response to myself. I am nothing. And so in that process, that manifests both physically, emotionally, and intellectually. Now, if we look at 3 levels, so there's the conscious aspect of the mind, the subconscious, and the unconscious. Most of our socialization inherently rests in the unconscious. A lot of us aren't aware that we're performing masculine things, we just do them, right? And so, in and of itself, in a way, that's not a bad thing. The problem is when we slide heavily into that space where, in order to feel okay, I need to essentially internalize all my emotions, not express them, dominate other people, control them, or coerce them, or all of the above. Right? And if I can't do that, I'm not going to feel good. Does that make sense?
It does. So I guess what you're saying is, but I'm assuming for a lot of men, they can't do that. So,
Well,
they're
that
not
hasn't been
they're not
socialized in it.
dominating. They're not dominating their families. They're not dominating the people around them at work. So there must be a lot of unhappy men who would be dominating but can't. Or if
And
this is
that's
what,
reflected in our mental health statistics. So we have this surging, these surging statistics in anxiety, depression, suicide, which, I tend to see suicide in men as an expression of rage, not only against themselves, but against society. It's like, of being emasculated. I never even got onto the rung half the time.
I
And they
think
don't
the reason I
see,
bring, I think the reason I bring that up is because so often when, like, if I'm in a class and I'm lecturing and I start talking about patriarchy, for a lot of them, and I think it falls flat because they don't experience themselves as dominating. They experience themselves as like struggling, frustrated, scared, working their butts off just to stay, caught up with expectations. So I think that the language of patriarchy for a lot of men doesn't resonate because they don't like, oh, I'm not in charge. I'm not dominating. How is this? How am I part of the leading group of people if I feel so lousy? And I think explaining that to men is one of the ways that we understand the price that they pay for patriarchy, not just those
yes.
around them. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the sort of comments I sometimes make is, look, all of us, to some degree or another, have drunk the Kool-Aid, except it came in a baby bottle. And no one told us that what's in the baby bottle is actually toxic. We just drank it. And some of us grew up big and strong and, but most of us sort of like struggled. There was the bullying in the playground and, then I, got into a relationship and my wife bullied me and didn't feel like I had anything to say, partly because a lot of men in this conundrum actually don't understand the difference between aggression and assertion because we don't have those benchmarks. The society media tells us that we're the problem because we're violent and we're perpetrators, and most of us sitting back, but I'm not like that. And then we get hammered for saying that. It's like you can't win. And what we get there is in psychology what we talk about learned helplessness. There's no way out for me, firstly, to repair my narcissistic wound, which really needs repair, because my sense of self or ego has been damaged in this socialization. I'm struggling to express my emotions. Half the time I don't even have the words. And then, out of frustration, I might smash a plate, and then, everyone freaks out. But we're also told directly, indirectly, that, don't step outside of yourself and ask for help. That's really bad. They'll just think you're a pussy. So where do we go? Now, it's gotten a bit better in the reaching out for help bit. But, in my practice, I still have to encourage men just to get medical help, because a lot of times there's medical issues that they're not addressing. And a lot of times those medical issues are attached to ideals of masculinity. Any sort of erectile dysfunction or anything to do with genitalia is a hassle.
I want to come back to it because I think there is a kind of double bind, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Around like the expression man flu bothered me before I really understood. It bothered me because it seemed like it was mocking men for getting sick and allegedly complaining too much. But we know from statistics that men don't go see doctors as much as they should, and you know, and so I was always really bothered by this man flu because I felt like it was shaming men from having symptoms, and then simultaneously saying you're a wuss if you complain, but also don't get sick at the same time.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It is shaming men. And here's the reason behind it. Right? We know from lots of research in infant attachment, Max Planck's done a whole bunch of stuff on this. It's really good work. Boys tend to be under-nurtured or over-nurtured. So you can imagine being a boy who's growing up and he loves mummy dearly and mummy loves him dearly, but you're not getting a lot of what you actually want. It's going to make you feel safe and secure. And dad's sort of by and large absent. Right? So he's not getting, the boy's not only not getting a lot of it from mum, but he's not getting a lot of it from dad, which is more common than the bit with mum. So as we get older, a lot of us as men enroll our intimate partners as maternal rather than keeping them as a passion base. I lust after this woman. We slip into this, she's got to care for me. And if you've been over-nurtured, God forbid any woman that gets into a relationship with that dude, because she can never do enough to make him feel cared for. So I see that stuff with the man flu as being part of that low-grade give me, but it's not about the flu, it's about emotion. It's about, I'm needy, hold me, nurture me. The only problem is for most women, that's a definite turn-off.
Well, not just that, but also it's like trying to get a problem solved by asking to solve a different problem and hoping, you're sort of misdirecting the very person you're asking for help. I need your emotional help, but I'm going to ask you, I'm going to complain about physical stuff. And so it's this kind of mixed signals of, I tell you I want one thing, if I tell you anything at all, and I'm actually trying to get something else, which, it can be it's sort of a double bind. I'm not going to get what I want, and so I'm going to be frustrated and feel uncared for.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the other thing that we know biologically speaking, and I'm not sure if this is an artifact, I tend to think it's an artifact of our socialization, is that by and large, men have a lower pain threshold than women. Now, some people attribute that to childbirthing and all that sort of stuff. But it's true. But there are men who are extraordinarily resilient with respect to pain. I never thought I had a very good pain threshold because my mother was out of the box with that stuff. And then, having recently had some surgeries, the feedback I got from surgeons was, man, I'm not sure how you're doing this, but someone else would be taking twice the amount of medication. I don't want the meds, just keep me through this. But I also know, like I said, in my grandsons, for example, there's a difference in how pain is dealt with between males. And I'll come back to that idea that one is we can't overgeneralize in this space if we're going to make an impact. We can't make it binary because it doesn't give us a strong enough, a powerful enough explanation. So,
You've just unlocked a whole bunch of questions for me. Let me just jump to one, which is what you just touched on, which is the individualization question and not overgeneralizing.
Yeah.
Because you've written, that in your work you're about helping each man find their own happiness, their own solutions. But how do you balance, giving advice and guidance with focusing on each individual's unique, like separate path? How do you balance that? Are they two different audiences? Are they, do you do something very different in your podcasting than you do in your counseling, your psychotherapy, or how do you deal with that variation, but yet at the same time wanting to talk to the broader population?
Really good question. Let me just think that through a little bit because there is a difference. On this show, we talk a lot about living with purpose, slowing down, paying attention, and being intentional about the choices we make every day. Because when we simplify the noise around us, we can better hear what really matters. Empathy, connection, and showing up as the best version of ourselves. That's why I'm genuinely pleased to welcome our newest sponsor, Distill Union. Their philosophy aligns beautifully with what we do here. Distill Union creates slick, thoughtfully designed essentials, wallets, key organizers, phone cases, all built with a less is more approach. Their Wally wallets, Ferris key organizers, these are everyday tools that make life easier, cleaner, and calmer. In that simplicity, there's space for clarity, there's space for change. As a thank you to our Inspire Change community, they're offering 20% off any product with the promo code Inspire Change. Have a look, try them out, and see how simplifying your day can open the door to something deeper. Visit distilledunion.com and enjoy 20% off any product with the promo code Inspire Change. That's distilledunion.com with promo code Inspire Change to check out. I do talk in generalities when I podcast. It's about patterns. In part, it's one of the things that I know helps us in terms of resilience is if we become good at pattern recognition. And the other bit is if we are good at metacognition, thinking about thinking, right? If we got those two skills, they're good tools to have in the box, right? Some people can overdo it though, and so that brings about some individual issues. In a podcast, I'm trying to alert people to think about the bigger picture and how it connects individually.
Mm-hmm.
In therapy, my main concern is identifying how this particular person has embodied their socialization, where there's a rupture and what sort of repair does that person need, right? And me telling them isn't going to fix it. I have to help them fundamentally explore around that. And occasionally I do give advice. So in my work, I talk about psychoeducation. So one of the things that I do psychoeducation with is the physiology. If you only get 4 hours sleep a day, you're going to be sleep deprived, and this is what it's going to mean. Okay, so here's the reason why I'm going to look at you and go, can you up the amount of hours you get for sleep? And if you can't, we need to look at why not. Right? So drinking, half a dozen stubbies before you go to bed is definitely going to interfere with your quality of sleep. So there is psychoeducation. On a psychodynamics, a psychological point of view, it's the better I can be with that person to help them come to their own understanding of themselves in terms of what's impacted them. Things like, what did it feel like when your mum and dad broke up? Right? Describe that to me. And when you think about that, where in your body do you experience it, if at all? And so it's this, I talk a lot about peeling the onion. Let's go through. We eventually get to the soft core and not freak out about the soft core.
All right, I'm going to redirect you completely. I was looking at some of your stuff, and you've sort of positioned a lot of your work as intentionally and explicitly apolitical and a-religious. You sort of stayed away from those things. And I'm going to ask you, because today I think a lot of the discussion of masculinity is both tremendously political and shot through with all kinds of religious assumptions right now. And that's in Australia, in the United States, elsewhere as well. So why do you try to draw this line up and say, make it apolitical and a-religious? And how has that affected the way that you go into this territory, the manosphere, given that it's so politically charged? So how do you deal with that, trying to stay away from religion and politics? The reason I'm originally from the States, your audience may or may not know, but and watching the way that the manosphere and masculine discussions of masculinity online has sort of morphed into politics by other means, and it's morphed into right versus left and women versus men and Republican versus Democrat in the States. So how and why and how do you try to keep, and we'll come back to that. Just to leave it at, what are you doing with it?
Right. So, listening to you, the first thing that stands out for me is you beautifully demonstrated the binary polarization, right? So, whenever, and this comes out of Gestalt therapy in particular, but whenever there is an internal conflict and there's tension between two polarities, you get anxiety, right? So, psychodynamically, we're in a constant state of anxiety as a result of polarizing things, right? Now, I'm going to be very blunt in many respects. If there are two things that have fucked humanity over really well, it's religion and politics. I cannot get away from that, no matter how I slice and dice it. And I know this offends some religious people, and I know it offends some people in politics. But politics doesn't need to be politics. And what I mean by that is that we can have a process, a social process that doesn't create this binary, Westminster system where we have to fight each other because we're in opposition. Because it's competitive, it's not collaborative. But immediately, and this is the same with religion, my God's better than your God. But what if we had both gods? Well, we can't have that. Really, I mean, the Romans sort of tried it with Christianity, but they didn't float. I mean, Rome had lots and lots of different religious cults, Mithraism, the cult of Isis, and so on. They actually worked that quite well, as long as you paid your tax and paid your tribute to the Senate or the Emperor, as it was later. You were okay. It's when you tried to overturn the system that they got a bit nasty about it. Sort of called sedition. Get it? So the idea why I go into I am fundamentally apolitical and a-religious is because I need a higher order of conceptualization philosophically, ethically, and morally. And so that led me to, in a sense, being a humanistic existentialist. If I'm going to put it bluntly, I'm not necessarily even that interested in gender issues like man, woman. I go, if we can preserve the human being in this, the ontology of being human, I think we're in a much better space. But we've got what we have, and that is, it's actually useful to understand our gender, better, whether that be male or female, and how that influences us relating. I think it's because of this insistence of making gender political that we got a lot of problems about, what's okay and what's not okay. Does that make sense? Does that answer that question?
It makes sense. I want to go back to the religion piece because we've talked a bit about a values orientation
Yeah.
and I think for a lot of, maybe traditionally, when I grew up in the Catholic tradition, and in a lot of my community, the value and morals were largely given not just by parents, but also by this church and religious education and Sunday school. And that was all sort of focused. And there's a lot of folks who point to the decreasing rate of church attendance and the decreasing influence of religion in people's lives, not every community, some communities, broadly in Australia, it's a demographic trend, and say, well, this is the problem. People feel like they're lost and isolated and alone because they don't have this community. And how would you respond to that? Saying, is that community interesting but obsolete? Is it something that there are elements of that we would, possibly create a new institutions? Or what do you do with that, like, sense of lost community, sense of lost, especially around morals and values and orientation?
We could have a conversation about this for a long time. Okay. I want you to understand, I want anybody listening to this understand that I'm not rabidly, militantly atheist.
Mm.
I have a strong sense of spirituality, which is both relational and reflexive. And so my belief in community is really important. And I would, in a way, have no issue at all if religion stayed out of politics and politics stayed out of religion. But it's almost like it's the same beast in different clothes. And so the formation of community as an agenda, and that agenda is to adhere to a particular both religious or theocratic, but also a political framework. And priests get themselves into difficulty with that often because, they're either conservative or progressive in a way, and it's interesting because in the Catholic Church, I mean, if I go back into church history, I completely identify with Francis of Assisi. No problem at all. The dude's great. I equally, if we could strip away all of the Roman stuff that shaped what Christianity is today, I have no problem with the teachings of the Christ. None at all. Very communitarian. I'm sure in the United States they'd call him a socialist, anarchic socialist.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a good Jew at the same time. But he wanted to elevate Judaism out of the Sanhedrin, out of the temple,
Mm-hmm.
and gift it to the people. And so the issue that we have come today, given we're at a crossroads and there's this resurgence of autocracy, both religion and politics is factionalized in that way, and the autocrats seem to be getting a stronger hold on it. Fortunately, the Catholic Church keeps coming up with the antithesis, and we had popes like Francis.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
I'm from Chicago originally, so yeah, I get.
Yeah.
I mean, because the reason I bring this up is, it seems to me right now there's competition for both diagnosing the problem. So people can agree rates of depression are high. Too many men are self-harming. There's too many young men who seem to be rudderless. And diagnosing the problem and the solution, there's a real competition out there.
Yes. Yeah.
In the world. And one is they just need that old-timey religion. They just need that old, whether it's fire and brimstone, or they just need that, and it'll straighten them out. Or they just need to go back, there's a whole competition for the meaning of these sacred ideas. And for a lot of us, it's led us to just get out of organized religion, because we've run up against somebody who used religion in a way to try to smash down individual differences and try to impose their point of view on everyone. And I think it's causing both the crisis of religion, but it's also making religion super important as a point of struggle. Something to struggle over.
All the religions, the main monotheistic religions, from my studies, have had a mystical school in it. So in Judaism, it's the Kabbalah, Sufi in Islam, and in the Catholic Church, there are a number of
charismatic.
mystics. And I think that's the core of we need to get into the core of what this is, and then fundamentally, it is, in my view, in my reading, technically about how is it that we can be the best human being that we can possibly be. That is always going to be relational. It's always going to be reflexive. It is never hierarchical.
Mm.
And so, if we apply this to gender, the Roman Church hijacked Christianity away from humanity and placed it into the patriarchy.
Yeah. No,
And that's happened in Islam as well.
I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, as a man, an older man who's married, I mean, I know that in some ways, my relationship with my wife is the most challenging relationship I have. It's the place where my biggest fears come out to be addressed and I have to deal with them. It's the one I care about the most. And hierarchy would be incompatible with that. Imposing my will on my wife is incompatible with the fact that that's my place to grow, the way I
Mm.
see it.
And that's what the evangelicals are asking. And if you go into Islam, it's the radical version, the fundamentalist version, that asks exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Which I find it so disturbing to think that this, which should be the person who's helping you to grow the most, because they are demanding your trust, the biggest investment of your life, your future together, all of these things. And yet these ideologies say, dominate this person. That's just, it's simply incompatible to me with growth.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And this is where I come back to is, so why am I spending all this time on the issues of masculinity, being male, being a man in our society? It's because part of the process conceptually is to help us to become more human and more humane, where values of equality and being distributive and being inclusive and being collaborative are expressed, not just given, tacit verbal approval, but it's my behavior on a daily basis in all my relationships.
Hmm. Well, that's really good. Um, when you're working in counseling and you've got a patient, a client, how do you help men to develop their emotional responsiveness and their ability to express and their resilience, especially given how society trains men to suppress their emotions? And how do you, because you talked about that, the line I think you said was something like, sometimes they don't even know what they're feeling. How do you help people to get it? Like, is there practices? Are there techniques?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, Greg. Um, so some of this came. I did a little bit of work, not as much as I would have liked to. There were some issues around that, but it's somatic psychotherapy, okay, and it's focused on the body, right? Now, fortunately, my training in Gestalt, which was really extensive, also brought that home. And
Would you briefly explain those two, just so that I don't know if your listeners know that?
yeah, okay. So somatic psychotherapy is a psychotherapy that works fundamentally through the body into the emotion and then, into our narrative, our story we tell ourselves.
So you're supposed to really learn to like
Tune
pay
into your
attention
body.
to attend to your body. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
How's Gestalt different from that?
Not a huge amount, except somatic psychotherapists are a lot more hands-on. And this is where we this is where we run into trouble these days when we have injunctions about touching the client, right? It's a bit, unfortunately, like teachers when a kid falls over, they can't give the kid a hug because it's not accepted. And that has all sorts of ramifications, which we need another podcast for.
Mm.
So those two things really, and my work in working with PTSD, where, Bessel van der Kolk says the body keeps the score. So our emotional traumas are stored physiologically, psychologically, and socially. And it's a reflexive thing. There's a cycle in this. And so part of the work is when someone starts telling a story, as the therapist, I'm an active tool in that process, right? So, and it could be as simple as, what's coming up for me as I'm listening to this person? Oh, I'm feeling a bit tense around my midriff. Oh, what's that about? Oh, I recognize part of that story in myself. So that might lead me to go, just stop for a moment and just reflect on your body. What is it that you're feeling and where are you feeling that? And most of the time, very few of us ever do that on our own accord. I might sit there watching a movie that makes me teary, but unlike women who let it out, most of us men sort of suck it back up and clench our jaw and hold our breath and at the end of the movie go, oh, I'm never going to get that hour and a half back. And so in therapy, as a therapist, as a male therapist, I need to have spent time both in my training and in my therapy exploring my own unfinished stuff because we all got it, you know. And so it allows me to recognize that and not inhibit. So when my client starts crying, I'm not going to redirect him and go, oh, by the way, how did it go with that job interview that you had the other day? I'm going to go, just let this, be in touch with it, let it happen,
Mm.
bring
Yeah,
it out.
it's true in conversation. So often we help each other to avoid true emotions. Like if somebody starts to get choked up, you almost feel like what you're supposed to do is to lighten the mood. That's your, like a job. But in fact, in counseling, you're doing the opposite. Therapy, you're doing the opposite.
One of the requests that I get from a lot of guys, especially mid 30s, late 20s, mid 30s, is I need some advice. And I go, I'm curious. What is it that makes you think that you do need advice from me? And they go, well, isn't that your job? Well, in certain situations it could be, but at the moment I haven't heard what the issue is. How about you share what it is that you're sort of grappling with, and let's see where we go with that.
So in terms of like how do you help people become more responsive and more is one of the things is actually to pay more attention to themselves, ironically.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
really interesting.
in a frame, and again, there's like in my therapy, there's several frameworks. One of the frameworks is about that whole notion of what is it that I'm looking to not necessarily achieve but experience, right? And so when I get that question directly, I go, I can give you a simple answer, but it's a lot more challenging to experience. So here's the answer. I want you to be more self-aware. I want you to be more flexible, more adaptable, and become more resilient. That way you and I can become redundant in each other's lives.
That's that's actually that could be a whole other question. How do you deal with that? My goal is to make it so that we stop having these conversations, not because you're sick of it, but because you've learned so much from the process.
Yeah, yeah. And it's embedded in spiritual practice, the whole notion of enlightenment. When you find the Buddha on the middle of the road, kill him.
Yeah, make them obsolete in the sense
Yeah.
that, yeah, learn it. One of the reasons I want to sort of bring this up is I wanted to touch on a couple of specialized issues. I don't know about how we're doing on time, but
I'll give it a little bit more time.
I was going to say that because I think one of the things that's interesting right now in masculinity is models of expression that are not suppressed emotion. So it's quite the opposite. Whether it's the influence of reality TV or I think like professional wrestling, the Trump presidency, there's this kind of like confrontational, we could say whiny, aggressive, quiet piggy hyper masculinity that's being celebrated to kind of like talk to the hand. There's like just a lot of different models for it of like trash talking. So how would you advise somebody who is finding themselves or others in their lives becoming more combative or more expressive emotions, but in ways that you think are not creating connection or creating vulnerability, but the opposite? They're about
Yeah.
dominating. So maybe we can get a patient there who's sort of you find is maybe doing
Yep.
this. How do you talk to them?
Okay. I'll give you well, I have these examples usually on a daily basis. That's
Oh,
number one. Okay. So our propensity to move towards aggression is based usually on fear or on that narcissistic wound. So there's a number of ways coming in it. So, the question might be, do you understand the difference between being assertive and being aggressive? And you see the difference between, being present without being controlling or coercive. If your partner says, honey, not tonight, do you persist in badgering her until she goes, oh, for fuck's sake, let's do it? Right? And that's sort of example. I'm quite blunt in that sort of situation. And usually you get some thinking, oh, well, you just got to be a bit persistent. Yeah, but at some point, there's difference between being persistent and being coercive. My rule of thumb is usually once, twice, and then I'll sort of go, okay, well, fair enough. But what comes up for a lot of men in those sort of situations is a sense of rejection. So an unstable relationship with self, or abandonment, which is part of that process as well. So they feel they have to get their need met now, and that's that immediate needs gratification. So in some men, it translates into aggression, and then rage, and then violence. And fortunately, usually the guys that I see aren't at that level. But a lot of them have said to me, I could see myself getting there. And it scared me, and that's why I've come to see you. And so for me, that is like a huge step into awareness. Because they've now detached from my immediate need that needs to be gratified into, I can delay gratification, but I need to understand me better. And so, yeah. So the other part of it is looking at, so where else in your life do you get really, really frustrated? And in what way? And how do you experience that? And if you could, what would you do about it? Because a lot of guys are not happy being, easily triggered. Over time, I've had lots of men who are also fathers. I don't know what it is, but my son really, he knows all my buttons. At the moment, we're in a Mexican standoff. He and I don't communicate. Oh, well, that's really sad. He goes, I know, but what do I do? Well, what is it that most of your communication consists of? Well, usually it's about checking homework, or, has he done his chores, or you put a dent in the car. Okay, so how much of the time do you spend checking in with him about how he is and what does he need from me today? And they usually go, I never have that conversation.
Interesting. Have we got time for one more double barrel question?
Sure. Let's do it.
Something very specific to. So first of all, you've recently started in anthropology, and I want to know what you hope to get from anthropology, and what are you hoping for the next? I mean, you've been doing this work for a long time, 40 years. What gives you hope about the future of your work, but also about this area, this field? So I guess I'm wondering, is there an anthropology part in the future for you, and what do you see that's given you hope for the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay, that's a really good question. So first, why anthropology? Because I think if I go and take this into pure psychology, they're going to want me, and I'm making an assumption here, I do not know this for sure, but having scanned the psychological research, they want me to look at this problem through a psychological lens. And my view is that that's insufficient. It's a bit like if I said to a chemist or a physicist, H2O consists of hydrogen and oxygen. Which bit makes it wet, right? And to me, that's the same as going, I can only look at this through the psychological lens. Yeah, but what about the social aspect of it, the ethnographic aspect to it? So that's one part. The other part of it is that for whatever reason, but I think inherently is because my work's effective, I have a seriously long waiting list. And unfortunately, what I hear through stories is when I see men who have tried several different therapists with whom they haven't clicked with. And part of my work is that I don't do anything until I feel like I've got a relationship with that person. There's some click. And that might happen in the first 15 minutes. And quite often it takes somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. And then I get this feeling and I go, okay, we're connecting. Because to me, the therapeutic relationship fundamentally is everything. You can be fantastic as an analyst or as a Gestalt therapist, but unless you can forge that human connection, none of that's really going to it'll help, but it won't be penetrating. And so that's one aspect of it. The other part of it is doing what I do. And because I tend to think about how I think and how to apply that to what I'm doing, is there are things that we've left out of the field of knowledge because we've only looked at it through one lens and not multiple lenses. And I think I can add something to the body of knowledges that we have that, one, hopefully gets us to talk to each other, collaborative, not competitive, Oh, look at those anthropologists. They're a bunch of weirdos hanging around in the bush. And then, the psychologists are like pseudoscientists, well, and the psychiatrists, well, walking prescription pads. None of that's useful. It represents the problem that we got at hand, which is a form of discrimination. It's an either or, silos, and I think we need to abandon that. And I'm not saying we need to dismantle faculties or schools. What I'm saying is we need to come together and talk. We need to have, in a way, for want of a better word, although they've come in somewhat disrepute in some areas, think tanks that bring this together. I mean, we've let the tech bros run rampant with no guardrails. There should have been, anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, maybe socialists involved as well, but and chewing this over. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. That's, Oppenheimer came to that conclusion. Does that help? So I think the legacy piece for me, because I know my age, and hopefully I've got, more than 10 years in me, maybe 15. I mean, I did a masterclass with George Rosner when he was in his early 80s. He was legally blind, but the dude was as sharp as anything. So that's my sense. And if I can coach, teach, I'd like to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I'm glad to be part of it. I mean, to me, it's one of the facts of our species' distinctive evolutionary capacity that we live our lives, we gain so much through experience, and unlike in other species, when basically the next generation you punch the reset button, not a lot of that gets passed on. Yeah. We're in a position to try to actually build ladders for each other, where the next generation doesn't have to make every single mistake we made. We can hopefully get them to a stage where they can make some interesting and new mistakes, and instead of the same ones we've been making. And that's the key to that is thinking about, how do I pass this on, or how do I help other people to do what I did quicker, come to the realizations, even if they have to experience it themselves firsthand. Maybe instead of having to make that mistake 10 times, they'll make it once or twice, and they'll read what I wrote and realize what's happening and move on more quickly. I mean, to me, that's part of it's almost like evolutionary.
Yeah, I agree. And especially in psychotherapy and in psychology, I think that if we're literally going to step into someone else's world, someone else's habitus, we need to have really checked in with ourselves through the work. And the work is psychotherapeutic in a way. Where I know myself enough to know where my potential blind spots might be, and have a continuing relationship with someone, not as a hierarchical supervision, but more as a peer with whom I share experience and knowledge with.
Well, and that to me is part of what anthropology. I mean, David Graeber was a heavy influence on me, one of the guys I knew in grad school, and He talks about how anthropology, in some ways, is a practice of freedom because you don't have to imagine alternatives. You can actually just go look at them. There's lots of
Yeah,
alternatives out there in the world if
yeah,
you just pay attention and listen.
yeah.
So you can sort of get a sense for the option set a bit better by looking at other societies, looking at other ways of doing psychotherapy. That you don't have to invent everything anew. You can learn from each other. So I feel like I should give a thank you to Gunter. But we've traded hats in this.
Yeah, yeah,
Thank you for being on my podcast, Gunter.
yeah. No, excellent. No, lovely being here. But my thanks to you as well. I mean, this was a great idea of yours. I really enjoyed it. You know, um, you know, it's interesting on some level. I'm quite private, but I love sharing. You know, what I think and how I think, and I like being challenged as well. If someone turns around and says, "Well, I think you're full of shit," then I go, "Okay, like let me in. Give me an understanding of why you say that. That doesn't tell me anything."
Mm.
So if you can step back and try not to be personally insulting, then we can have a
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
If you persist,
What piece of this doesn't ring true?
yeah, yeah,
What fact have I not taken into consideration
yeah,
that you think I
yeah,
need to,
yeah.
digest? Yeah.
All right, Greg, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And as always, if this has triggered a little bit of inspiration, by all means, share that with others. But as always, inspire change and keep on keeping on.
Greetings, listeners. It's that time of year again. Yes, you heard me. The holidays, they're fast approaching, and we all know what that means. Parties, gatherings, work and business socials. Well, science has evolved, and there is no reason to waste time trying to recover from a night of celebrating. You may know what I mean if you have ever had a few too many. That dreaded next morning where your head is pounding and you can't fathom the thought of getting up to use the restroom. Horrible. That's why we believe in the scientific triumph that is morning recovery. It's scientifically formulated to help you bounce back after a night of drinking. It's made with ingredients like milk thistle and ginseng to help you recover from last night's festivities. Plus, it's loaded with electrolytes and B vitamins that replenish lost nutrients. It is seriously a game changer. And your new drink one before having a good time and wake up ready for anything drink. So head to morelabs.com to use your code. That's 25% off when you use our code Inspire Change, or go to the link www.morelabs.com/discount/Inspire Change for your convenience. We've placed the link and more information on More Labs in the show notes. We hope More Labs makes a difference for you, and we would love your testimonial. Please see the show notes for our contact information. Hello to all our listeners. We thank you for tuning in and promoting positive social change. This makes you a part of Gunter's efforts in transforming not only men's lives, but lives in general, and we are grateful you have joined us. This week, we're taking a look at the global listeners list, and we would like to share our gratitude with our listeners in the UK. You made it to number 3 on our global listeners list. And a special shout out to London, Cambridge, Camden, and Lambeth, as well as Falkirk, Scotland, for being the top listeners within the UK. Congratulations! We thank you so much for your continued support, and we appreciate your efforts to support positive social change. I, Devonna Prinzi, the co-executive producer, and our showrunner, Miranda Spigner-Sapone, sincerely thank you and ask that you please take the time to like, follow, subscribe, and share, as your efforts make a difference to everyone here at Inspire Change with Gunter. Please remember, if you want to share your story of social change, feel free to reach out to the show directly. Please see the show notes for our contact information. As always, thank you to each and every one of our listeners, and most importantly, please keep inspiring positive social change.
Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunter.com. gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.